We know that other assets will be on the block.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the honourable member Todd McClay.
Mr Speaker, thank you. The last speaker in the debate, in fact the author of this bill, Mr Cosgrove, asked government members to stand up and say, would we support this legislation? And I can categorically say to Mr Cosgrove, the answer is no, we will not be supporting this. You see, this is an opportunist piece of legislation that continues a discussion with the public of New Zealand that was held for the whole of last year and that the New Zealand public had an opportunity to vote on. This legislation also is unworkable, and I will address that in a moment. You see, Mr Speaker, this Labour members' bill seeks to entrench Schedules 1 and 2 of the State-Owned Enterprises Act and Schedule 2 of the Crown Enterprises Act, so that removal of any identity from the schedules would require agreement of 75% of the House or a majority of votes in a public referendum. So isn't that wonderful? Mr Cosgrove is saying that it would take 75% of the members of this House to do anything else around any partial sale or full sale of these assets in the schedules of these two acts. But what he hasn't realised is to amend this legislation or to throw this legislation out if it became law would take a simple majority of the House. So one vote more in favour than against would destroy this piece of legislation that he's thought long and hard about and would get rid of it. What I would also say, Mr Speaker, is in as far as asset sales are concerned, Kate Wilkinson last year campaigned on the mixed ownership model. She campaigned on reducing debt. She campaigned on making sure that the government was accountable in as far as the economy is concerned. She campaigned on investing in new assets for New Zealanders. And she won that election and went from being a list MP to a constituent MP. A list MP to a constituent MP. In the seat of Waimakariri, we also had the incumbent MP, Mr Cosgrove, who's brought this before the House. He did not campaign on this piece of legislation. He didn't campaign on it, Mr Speaker. What he did was campaigned against the mixed ownership model, the partial sale of assets. He campaigned against the government getting debt under control, investing more in the New Zealand economy on growing our asset base for New Zealanders. And what happened in that election? He went from being the constituent MP to a list MP. So, Mr Speaker, the people of New Zealand, all over New Zealand, but in particular the Waimakariri electorate, had a chance to consider supporting a list MP who was campaigning on a mixed ownership model of the partial sale of assets, or for an incumbent MP who was saying, don't sell these assets, let's not have the mixed ownership model, and I can tell you that their voice was clear. I also note from one of my colleagues said that during that campaign, when Mr Cosgrove realised it was not going as well as he wanted, he debranded from the Labour Party. The Labour slogans were taken down all over the place. He took them off his hoardings, he got rid of them, and he became Clayton Cosgrove, man of the people. Well, the people didn't want him as their man. They wanted a great woman, Kate Wilkinson, and good on them. Now, Mr Speaker, I wanted to say in this bill, there are a couple of issues that are of particular concern. And one of those is around what's happened in the past and what could happen in the future. The only piece of legislation we have enacted in New Zealand with the same provision, currently entrenched in law in this manner, is the Electoral Act. And that's important because we don't want parties playing around with electoral law just because there may be a bit of political gain in that. Well, indeed, all that Mr Cosgrove is trying to do with this piece of legislation is mislead New Zealanders, drag them back to the debate that happened over the whole of last year when John Key, as Prime Minister, made a case to them, and more New Zealanders voted for John Key and the National Party than any other party ever under MMP, and actually that was the second time election in a row that was the case. Mr Cosgrove is trying to divert New Zealanders from that and the job at hand. Let's have a look at the record of the Labour Party in issues like this that must have motivated Mr Cosgrove to draft this bill, to go out and consult with New Zealanders and then to put it in the ballot and bring it to the House. So what have they done under the mixed ownership model previously? Well, we know that they never enshrined in law a mixed ownership model that would guarantee under the law 51% ownership of any state asset under the Crown. We know they didn't do that. When they had an opportunity, they sold things wholesale, left, right and in the centre as fast as they could. So they've said they're opposed to the partial sale of state-owned enterprises. Well, with the Mr Cosgrove's members' bill, they want to entrench the ownership of the government shares in SOEs into law. Yet when they were last in government, they established a mixed ownership model for Air New Zealand. They didn't do it then. It was all right for them back then with Air New Zealand. But today, after not campaigning on this issue, after not raising this with the public, after going out and saying they were against the mixed ownership model, but being rejected resoundingly by the public and sent back to opposition, not just sent back to opposition, but with fewer members of parliament, fewer constituent MPs, more list MPs like Mr Cosgrove, now they're in favour of it. And then they went on to, they sold government-owned shares in the airline. So they sold those shares, but they wouldn't entrench it. In 2007, they sold 49% of the state-owned Spring Creek mine for millions of dollars to an American multinational. That sale was approved by Trevor Mallard. They didn't entrench anything then. They sold it wholesale. And then we had, when they were in government, the time before that, Labor sold 15 state assets for almost $10 billion in 3 years, supported by Phil Goff and Ed King, and again Trevor Mallard. Now, no legislation to entrench anything then, Mr Speaker, just today they want to do it after having not campaigned on this legislation, gone out to the people of New Zealand to make a case against the mixed ownership model, and New Zealanders voted in a government who are focused on what's right for this country. And then they refused, they also don't include any electricity generation on the list of infrastructure assets that they think must be owned by the Crown, and they refused to commit to buying back a single share sold under the mixed ownership model. And as Mr Cosgrove has made challenges to us, I ask him to stand up and make a commitment that under a Labor government they would buy back those shares. I recognise one party has a position on that, but the party that are making the most noise on this issue certainly haven't. Mr Speaker, the reason we won't be supporting this legislation is it does nothing about what's important to New Zealanders. It does nothing about law and order, making people safer in their communities, nothing about getting rid of intimidation from gang members. They had an opportunity, they didn't support that earlier here today. It does nothing about what's important to New Zealanders and why we were re-elected with an increased vote. This government, Mr Speaker, is focused on responsible management of government's finances and returning us back to surplus, reducing debt, building a more competitive and productive economy by investing more in assets for New Zealanders, delivering better public services for New Zealanders, something New Zealanders wanted, they voted for in the past, and they will vote for again, and of course rebuilding Christchurch. If Mr what's the member who lost his seat to Kate Wilkinson's name? If Mr Cosgrove had his way, then he would get rid of all of that. There would be more debt, there would be less responsibility in government, there would be fewer public services delivered for New Zealanders that need them, and Christchurch, on the edge of the electorate that he used to be the Member of Parliament for and now is no longer, would not be rebuilt. Mr Speaker, we will not be voting for this legislation, and I'm appalled that Mr Cosgrove has taken up the House's time with such an unuseful piece of legislation. Thank you.
I call the Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Speaker, the member